Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something you probably never considered while drifting off to sleep. The absolutely brutal reality of being a monk in medieval times. You see the pictures, right? Serene cloisters, illuminated manuscripts, a life of quiet contemplation. A pretty picture, sure, but the reality was far grittier. Forget the peace and quiet. Imagine bone-chilling cold, endless hunger, and a relentless schedule that would break most of us today. So if you're listening, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Alright, find that cozy spot, pull your covers tighter around you, because we're about to peel back the layers of romanticized history and dive into a life that was frankly miserable. You open your eyes, not to the gentle glow of a bedside lamp, but to the cold, creeping pre-dawn gloom of a monastic cell, a space so Spartan it makes your modern minimalist apartment look like a king's palace. You chose this, or perhaps it was chosen for you, your path irrevocably sealed by a vow, a crisis, or the crushing weight of societal expectation in a world utterly alien to your own. You came seeking salvation or refuge from a world ravaged by plague, famine, and incessant warfare. Perhaps your family, too poor to support you, saw the monastery as a respectable dumping ground, a place where at least you wouldn't starve in the streets, even if you'd slowly starve in soul. Or maybe, just maybe, a genuine spiritual calling, a fervent desire for communion with the divine, propelled you through those massive, unforgiving oak doors. But whatever the reason, the moment you crossed the threshold, you weren't just leaving your old life behind, you were stepping into a different dimension of existence, one governed by rules so strict, so encompassing, they would make your every breath a monitored act. Consider the weight of that decision, that final public act of renunciation. You stood before the abbot, your face perhaps pale with a mixture of fear and conviction as you formally made your vows. Poverty, chastity, obedience. These weren't just abstract concepts. They were concrete shackles, each one designed to systematically dismantle your individual identity and forge you into a faceless cog in the monastic machine. Poverty meant everything you once owned. Every comfort, every personal possession was gone. Not donated to charity, not put into storage, but simply ceased to be yours. Your rough wool habit, often scratchy against your skin and never truly warm, was your only garment. Your wooden bowl and spoon, your single threadbare blanket, these were the sum total of your worldly goods. Imagine never again having the freedom to choose your clothes, your food, your bed. The utter stripping away of personal agency, of the ability to make even the most mundane choices that define your modern existence, would be a profound shock to your system. You wouldn't even choose the path you walked from the refectory to the chapel. That too would be dictated by the rigid order of procession. Then came chastity, a vow that for many wasn't just about abstaining from physical intimacy. It was about severing ties to family, to earthly affections, to the very human need for deep personal connection and love. No spouse, no children, no tender embraces, just the cold, impersonal fraternity of your fellow monks, a community often bound more by shared suffering and rigid rules than by genuine affection. Any fleeting thought of warmth, of softness, of a loving hand would be a sin, a temptation to be wrestled with, confessed, and brutally suppressed. You'd be taught that such desires were earthly snares, distractions from the true love of God. But deep within your human heart, a quiet ache, a yearning for what you'd given up, would persist, a constant battle fought in the echoing silence of your cell. You'd feel the biological imperatives of your body, the insistent hum of life, and you'd have to crush it day after day, year after year, until perhaps, eventually, it withered into a dull throb. The psychological toll of this constant self-denial, this war against your own nature, would be immense. Your dreams, when they came, would sometimes betray you, bringing forth images of forbidden pleasure, leaving you to wake with a crushing weight of guilt, and shame. But perhaps the most insidious, the most soul-crushing of the vows was obedience. This wasn't just about following rules. It was about surrendering your will, your intellect, your very capacity for independent thought to the abbot or to the monastic rule itself. You were to obey without question, without hesitation, without reservation. If the abbot commanded you to perform a task you found senseless, degrading, or physically impossible, you were to do it, not with grudging compliance, but with cheerful alacrity, viewing it as an act of piety. Your opinions, your desires, your personal judgment, all were to be subjugated. Think about your daily life now, your ability to choose your job, your hobbies, your friends, your food, your very thoughts. Now imagine that all of it, every single aspect, was dictated by another human being whose word was law, backed by the divine authority of God. Every conversation, every action, every moment of your day would be filtered through this lens of absolute submission. You would speak only when permitted and then only on approved topics. You would work where you were assigned, eat what was given, sleep when the bell tolled, and rise when the cold stone called you back to duty. This wasn't just discipline, it was a systematic deconstruction of the self. Your identity, your personal history, your aspirations, all were secondary to the corporate identity of the monastery and the pursuit of a collective, rigid piety. You would be stripped of your given name, often receiving a new one, a monastic name, further erasing your past. The purpose was to break the ego, to humble the individual to such an extent that only God remained. But for many the cost was a profound and crushing sense of self-loss, a quiet despair that settled deep into the bones. You might have arrived with a fervent heart, full of zeal, but the relentless grind of absolute obedience would slowly chip away at your spirit, leaving you hollowed out, a mere vessel for the rules. The physical environment itself would be your first teacher in this harsh, new reality. The moment you entered, the weight of the massive stone walls would press in on you. The air would be perpetually damp, carrying the scent of old parchment, stale incense, and unwashed bodies underscored by the faint, persistent aroma of damp earth and wood smoke. The cloisters, which in paintings look so peaceful, would be icy cold for most of the year, the flagstones biting through the thin soles of your sandals. Your rough habit, the wool coarse against your skin, would offer little comfort against the biting wind that seemed to find its way into every nook and cranny. You'd constantly feel the chill, a persistent ache in your joints, a low thrum of discomfort that became an inseparable part of your existence. You'd sleep on a hard cot, often stuffed with straw that quickly became lumpy and infested, your single scratchy blanket offering meager warmth, every single element of this new life. From the spiritual vows to the physical environment, was designed to test your resolve, to break your will, to force you into a mold removed from any modern conception of comfort or personal fulfillment. The romanticized image of a monk serenely contemplating the heavens utterly fails to capture the immense, brutal sacrifice required to simply exist within those walls. You weren't just praying, you were enduring. You weren't just meditating, you were fighting a constant internal battle against your own humanity, against the relentless demands of a life crafted for spiritual perfection, but delivered through physical deprivation and psychological subjugation. This was your new reality, and the dawn of your first monastic day would only bring more of the same in an unending cycle of pious misery. You might have thought you were entering paradise, but you were truly stepping into a purgatory of self-denial. Wake up. No, not to a gentle alarm or the soft filter of morning light. You wake with a jolt, pulled from the shallow depths of sleep by the jarring, unyielding clang of the bell, often still hours before dawn. It's midnight, or maybe 2 a.m., the exact time determined by the monastic rule, the horarium, a schedule so inflexible, so demanding, that it becomes the absolute master of your every minute, your every breath. This isn't a suggestion. It's a divine imperative, a relentless, unceasing rhythm that governs the entire monastery, and by extension, your entire being. From this moment until you collapse back onto your hard cot many hours later, you are not your own. Your body, your mind, your very spirit are bound by the iron grip of the schedule. The first call is for matins, sometimes combined with lauds, the nocturnal office. You stumble out of your uncomfortable cot, the straw rustling beneath you, your body still heavy with sleep that never truly feels restorative. The air in your dormitory is frigid, a biting cold that seeps into your bones the moment you emerge from under your thin blanket. There's no fire, no warmth to greet you. You quickly pull on your rough habit, the coarse wool chafing against your skin, a familiar discomfort. There's no time for contemplation of your morning routine. It's a practiced, almost ritualistic movement in the dark, guided by habit and the urgent need to make it to the chapel before the abbot, or worse, before the bell finishes its final peal. Latence, even by a minute, is a sin, a mark against your obedience, and a potential penance. You join the silent procession of figures cloaked in shadow shuffling towards the chapel. The flagstones are icy beneath your rough sandals, sending a shiver up your legs. The chapel itself is even colder, often unheated, the stone walls radiating a penetrating dampness. Imagine sitting, or more often standing and kneeling, for hours in this biting cold, in near total darkness, illuminated only by a few flickering candles that cast long, dancing shadows across the ancient stone and the gaunt faces of your brethren. Your eyes strain in the gloom to read the psalms and hymns from heavy, often hand-copied books, the Latin text a constant mental effort, even if you are literate. Many monks weren't, and so the words were a drone, a meaningless recital, demanding only physical presence and the performance of an outward piety. Your voice, rough with sleep and the cold, joins the communal chant, a low, monotonous hum that fills the vast, cavernous space. Your knees ache from hours of kneeling on the hard, unyielding stone. Your back stiffens from standing. Your eyes burn from the strain of the dim light and the relentless focus. Your mind, dulled by sleep deprivation, drifts despite your best efforts. Thoughts of warmth, of food, of the simple pleasure of an uninterrupted night's rest are temptations that you must constantly fight against. This is not meditation as you understand it. This is a grueling physical and mental endurance test, performed day in and day out, year after year. The cold permeates your skin, sinking deep into your joints, making them protest with every movement. You shiver, trying to appear devout, trying to focus on the words, but the physical discomfort is a constant nagging presence. A low thrum beneath the surface of your consciousness. After matins and lauds, there's often a brief precious window of time, perhaps an hour, when you are permitted to return to your dormitory. But it's not for true sleep. It's a brief respite, a chance to perhaps snatch a few more minutes of rest, or to use the communal latrines. Another cold, often foul-smelling journey. This meager allowance only serves to make the subsequent waking even more jarring, the body confused and still aching for deep, restorative sleep. Then comes prime, usually around 6 a.m., signaling the beginning of the day proper, even though the sun may still be a distant promise. Back to the chapel you go, the cold still clinging to your limbs. More psalms, more prayers, another hour or so of standing, kneeling, chanting. By this point, your stomach is rumbling, not just from hunger, but from the sheer exhaustion of your body. The only sustenance you've had since the previous day's meager meal is perhaps a sip of stale water. You're already tired, and the day has barely begun. Terce, around 9 a.m., brings yet another round of prayer. This cycle, this relentless turning of the liturgical wheel, means that for a significant portion of your waking hours, you are in the chapel performing ritualistic acts. This leaves little time for anything else, and every other activity must be crammed into the precious, fleeting intervals between the canonical hours. After terce, Perhaps you are finally permitted the first meal of the day, a meagre affair of watery gruel, or hard bread washed down with weak, often sour ale. Silence is strictly observed during meals in the refectory, a large, often draughty hall. There's no conversation, no laughter, no shared camaraderie. Instead, a monk reads aloud from scripture or a holy text, his voice a monotonous drone against the clatter of wooden spoons on wooden bowls. You eat quickly, fueled by hunger, but without pleasure, without the luxury of savoring flavors. The food is sustenance, nothing more, and often barely that. The psychological impact of eating in such rigid, silent formality, day after day, would strip the joy from one of life's most fundamental pleasures. Your only focus is to get the food into your stomach, to quiet the gnawing emptiness, and to do so without drawing attention or breaking the rule of silence. The work begins after the meal. This is when the practical necessities of running a self-sufficient monastery come into play. For you, this might mean hours in the fields, tilling the unforgiving soil, harvesting crops under a blistering summer sun, or in the biting winds of autumn. Your hands, unaccustomed to such labor, quickly blister and crack. Your back aches, your muscles protest, but there is no relief. Or perhaps you are assigned to the kitchen, a hot, smoky, chaotic environment where the smell of stale cooking fat and simmering stew clings to your habit. You might spend your days scrubbing enormous iron pots, peeling vegetables, or kneading dough for the daily bread, your arms aching from the repetitive motions. If you're lucky or educated, you might be assigned to the scriptorium, a slightly warmer space where you spend hours hunched over parchment, meticulously copying texts by flickering candlelight, your eyes burning from the strain, your hand cramping from the precise, delicate work. But even this intellectual labor is relentless, a silent, solitary grind. Sext, at noon, breaks the work for another round of prayers in the chapel. Then none at 3 p.m., again drawing you back for more chanting and genuflecting. The day is a relentless series of bells, prayers, and labor, with precious little time for personal reflection, for rest, or for any activity not directly sanctioned by the rule. By mid-afternoon, you are utterly drained both physically and mentally. Your body is a symphony of aches and pains, your back, your knees, your hands, your feet. Your mind is a foggy landscape of exhaustion, struggling to maintain focus, to keep the temptations of sleep, of comfort, of simple human interaction. At bay. Vespers, the evening prayer, typically around 6 p.m., marks the approaching end of the working day, but not the end of your duties. This is often the longest service of the afternoon, and your voice is hoarse, your body heavy, your spirit weary. The light is fading outside, plunging the chapel into a deeper gloom, and the cold seems to intensify as dusk falls. By this point, you're operating on sheer willpower, your spiritual fervor battling against the insistent demands of your exhausted flesh. After Vespers, there's usually a second, equally meager meal in the refectory, again in silence. It offers little comfort or energy, merely a temporary appeasement of the gnawing hunger. And then finally, the last office of the day, compline, often around 8 p.m. This is the final prayer before the great silence, a period of absolute quiet that extends through the night until the first bell of matin. Compline is meant to be a prayer for protection through the night, a final cleansing of the day's sins, but for you, it's often a desperate plea for the simple mercy of sleep. Your voice might crack with fatigue as you chant the final psalms, your eyes burning with unshed tears of exhaustion after compline. You return to the dormitory in absolute silence and darkness, guided by memory and the dim glow of a single lamp carried by a senior monk. There's no talking, no personal moments, no winding down. You simply prepare for bed, perform your final ablutions in the cold, rudimentary privies, and collapse onto your straw-filled cot. Your body is stiff, your muscles screaming, your mind a muddled mess of half-remembered prayers and the persistent ache of hunger. Sleep, when it comes, is often shallow and fitful, haunted by the anticipation of that brutal, unforgiving bell that will yank you back into the herarium's iron grip in just a few short, precious hours. This relentless cycle, this systematic deprivation of sleep, comfort, and personal freedom was not an occasional trial. It was the unchanging, unyielding reality of every single day, for years, for decades, for the entirety of your monastic life. You were a slave to the bell, a prisoner of the clock, your entire existence dictated by a regimen designed to break your earthly will and, perhaps if you endured, bring you closer to a distant, abstract God. Your stomach growls a hollow, insistent ache that has become as familiar to you as the rough wool of your habit. You're always a little hungry. Forget the bountiful banquets you might associate with medieval times. For the common monk, meals were a stark exercise in deprivation, a constant reminder of your vow of poverty and the spiritual discipline of self-denial. This wasn't just about eating simply. It was about eating poorly, monotonously, and often inadequately. Picture yourself in the refectory, the dining hall. It's a vast, often cavernous room, typically cold and draughty. The tables are rough-hewn wood, scrubbed clean, but bearing the scars of countless meals. There are no individual plates or cutlery as you know them. Instead, you might share a wooden trench with a few other monks, each of you allotted a portion of the day's meager fare. Your only utensil is often a simple wooden spoon, or sometimes just your fingers. And as we discussed, silence reigns supreme. The only sound is the drone of a reader, reciting scripture or some other pious text from a pulpit, his voice echoing in the vast space, further emphasizing the solemnity and the absence of any joyous human interaction. What's on the menu? Don't expect roasted meat, spiced wines, or sweet pastries. Your staple diet revolves around coarse, dark bread, often heavy and chewy, sometimes stale, and a thin, watery gruel or pottage made from whatever grains or vegetables the monastery could grow or acquire. Think beans, peas, cabbage, and sometimes onions. Fish might make an appearance, particularly on fast days, but it would be dried or salted, hardly a delicacy. Eggs and cheese were rare luxuries, usually reserved for the sick or for special feast days, and even then, in very modest portions. Meat, the very concept of a satisfying cut of roasted animal, was largely forbidden by most monastic rules for all but the most infirm. This wasn't just a dietary choice. It was a spiritual injunction, a constant reminder to mortify the flesh. The absence of fats, of rich flavors, of variety, would make every meal a test of endurance rather than a source of pleasure. Your drink of choice? Water often drawn from a well and potentially tainted or, more commonly, weak ale. This wasn't a choice for enjoyment. It was a pragmatic necessity in a world where water quality was dubious. The ale was thin, low in alcohol, and served more as a form of liquid bread, providing a minimal amount of calories and making the water safer to drink. It certainly didn't offer any sense of relaxation or conviviality. Imagine every single day the same bland, repetitive food, devoid of seasoning, consumed in silence, your body constantly craving more. The psychological impact of this lack of culinary pleasure, this persistent dullness of taste, would be profound. Eating is one of life's simple joys, a moment of connection and sensory delight. For you it was merely fuel, a grim necessity, but the deprivation didn't end there. Fasting was a cornerstone of monastic life, not an occasional observance, but a frequent, almost continuous state. Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, was a period of extreme fasting, often involving only one small meal a day, eaten in the late afternoon, and strict prohibitions against certain foods. Advent, the period before Christmas, brought similar, though sometimes slightly less severe, restrictions. And beyond these major liturgical seasons, many monastic rules mandated weekly fasts, often on Wednesdays and Fridays, or on the vigils of major feast days. Imagine enduring physical labor, constant prayer, and sleep deprivation. all while your body is weakened by chronic caloric restriction. The hunger would be a gnawing pain, a constant companion that sapped your strength, clouded your mind, and tested your spiritual resolve at every turn. You'd feel the weakness in your limbs, the lightheadedness, the persistent emptiness in your gut. Your bones would ache not just from the cold and the hard kneeling, but from a lack of proper nutrition. The very act of reading or concentrating would become an effort, your mind struggling against the persistent haze of hunger. Temptation would be a constant battle, a stray thought of a succulent roast, a sweet fruit, a hearty loaf of bread. These mental images, fueled by your body's desperate cries, would be seen as the devil's whispers, requiring fierce resistance and confession. The shame of even thinking about forbidden foods would add another layer to your suffering. The preparation of food itself, if you were assigned to the kitchen, offered its own particular torture. You'd be surrounded by the smells of simmering stews, roasting meats, for the abbot or guests perhaps, or for the infirmary, the aroma of freshly baked bread for others, while knowing your own portion would be meager and bland. The discipline required to prepare food for others, to smell it, to handle it, without succumbing to the temptation to sneak a morsel, would be immense. You'd watch the other monks eat, knowing their hunger mirrored your own, a silent, shared burden of physical deprivation. Beyond the sheer monotony and caloric deficit, there were the issues of basic hygiene and food safety in medieval times. Food storage was rudimentary. Contamination was common. Water sources were often questionable. This meant that dysentery, food poisoning, and various nutrient deficiencies were not just risks but common occurrences. You might suffer from persistent stomach ailments, from scurvy, a lack of vitamin C, or from other illnesses brought on by an unbalanced, inadequate diet. The suffering wasn't just the gnawing hunger, it was the sickness that often accompanied it, adding another layer of physical pain and weakness to an already arduous life. You'd feel a persistent malaise, a lack of vitality, a body constantly on the verge of breaking down. The feast days, when they arrived, were hardly feasts by modern standards. Perhaps a slightly larger portion of bread, a bit of cheese, or an egg. Maybe, just maybe, a small serving of a more palatable vegetable dish. These rare occasions would be savoured not for their culinary excellence, but for their momentary deviation from the relentless monotony and deprivation. But even these small concessions were fleeting, a brief flicker of light before plunging back into the usual austerity. The joy would be momentary, swiftly replaced by the familiar ache of hunger and the grim reality of the next day's meager meal. This constant, low-level hunger, this chronic state of insufficient nourishment, would permeate every aspect of your existence. It would dull your senses, slow your movements, and constantly distract your mind from prayer. It would make the cold feel even colder, the labor even harder, the silence even more oppressive. You would learn to live with it, to suppress its urgent demands, to view it as a path to spiritual purity. But deep down, your body, your very being, would yearn for warmth, for flavor, for satiation. The monastery didn't just feed your soul, it starved your body, a brutal, relentless process designed to break the flesh and, hopefully, elevate the spirit. But for many, it simply led to a life lived in a perpetual state of physical misery, a constant battle against the most fundamental of human needs. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a world without central heating, without proper insulation, without easily accessible hot water or even functional plumbing. Now wrap that image around the thick, cold stone walls of a medieval monastery, and you begin to grasp the environmental nightmare you would inhabit as a monk. Your very surroundings were a constant source of physical discomfort, a relentless assault on your senses that permeated every waking and sleeping moment. The cold. Oh, the pervasive, biting, inescapable cold. Monastery buildings were constructed from massive blocks of stone, a material excellent for defense and permanence, but absolutely terrible for warmth. Stone radiates cold, Even in the height of summer, a coolness would linger in the deep recesses of the cloisters, but for 3/4 of the year, the cold was your constant companion. It wasn't just a chill. It was a penetrating, bone-deep cold that seeped into your very marrow. The heavy woolen habit, while better than nothing, was insufficient. You'd layer it perhaps with an under-tunic, but the drafts, the dampness, the sheer thermal mass of the building would conspire to keep you perpetually shivering. Imagine sitting in the chapel for hours in the dead of winter, the unheated space barely warmer than the outside air. Your breath would fog in front of you as you chanted, your fingers numb as you turned the pages of your psalter. Your feet, clad in thin sandals or simple leather shoes, would ache from the cold seeping up from the flagstone floor. Your knees, already protesting from hours of kneeling, would throb with a dull, persistent ache that no amount of shifting could alleviate. Even in the refectory where food was consumed, or the scriptorium where you worked, heating was rudimentary at best. A single brazier or a small fireplace might offer a tiny circle of warmth, but the vastness of the room meant that most of you would be far from its meager embrace, huddling together for whatever body heat you could share. You'd learn to position yourself strategically during communal activities, trying to catch a stray draft of warmth, but mostly you'd simply endure. Your body would become accustomed to a perpetual state of chill, a constant low-grade hypothermia that sapped your energy and made every movement an effort. And with the cold came the dampness. Stone buildings, especially in regions with heavy rainfall or near water sources, are inherently damp. The air would often feel heavy with moisture, and a subtle, persistent smell of damp earth and mold would cling to everything. Your habit, your bedclothes, your very skin would carry this scent. Books would warp, parchment would curl, and the very structure of the building would seem to weep with the pervasive moisture. This dampness exacerbated the cold, making it feel even more penetrating, and contributed to a host of ailments, from persistent coughs to debilitating joint pain, known then as rheum. You'd feel it in your lungs, a persistent tightness, and in your knuckles, a constant ache that made fine motor tasks like writing or intricate carving a painful endeavor. Then there was the filth, a reality so starkly different from your sanitized modern world it's hard to truly grasp. Sanitation in a medieval monastery was rudimentary at best. Latrines, or privies, were typically communal, often nothing more than a row of holes over a cesspit or a channel of flowing water. They would stink, of course, a pervasive stench that, while you might grow accustomed to its presence, would be an undeniable assault on your sense of smell. Cleanliness of the body was not a high priority, seen by some as a worldly vanity. Full baths were rare, perhaps once or twice a year, if that. You would wash your hands and face, perhaps your feet, but the idea of a daily shower with hot, running water would be utterly fantastical. Your body would carry a subtle, persistent odor of sweat, unwashed skin, and damp wool, intermingled with the smells of the monastery itself. This lack of personal hygiene, combined with the close quarters of the dormitory, made vermin an inevitable part of your life. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were constant companions. You'd feel the incessant itch on your scalp, on your body, a discreet scratch, a common, almost unconscious gesture. You'd learn to meticulously pick through the seams of your habit, searching for the tiny, biting insects, but they were ever present. An inescapable nuisance that constantly reminded you of your lack of personal control and the harsh realities of medieval existence. Rats and mice, too, were part of the monastic ecosystem, scampering through the walls, raiding the meager provisions, and adding to the overall sense of pervasive uncleanliness. Their droppings, their rustling in the dark, their sheer numbers would be a constant, unwelcome presence. Personal space, a fundamental concept in your modern world, was virtually non-existent. You slept in a dormitory with dozens of other monks, often in open rows of beds or in small, curtained cubicles that offered little privacy. Every snore, every cough, every rustle of a restless brother would be audible. There was no escaping the sounds, the smells, the sheer presence of others. Even your cell, if you were an abbot or a monk of long standing, would be a tiny, unheated space, barely big enough for a cot, a small table, and a stool. It was a place for solitude, yes, but also a place of stark, cold confinement. The silence you sought was often punctuated by the low hum of the monastery, the occasional cough, the shifting of bodies, the creaking of old timber. Light, too, was a precious commodity. Windows were small and often unglazed or covered with animal hide or thin horn, letting in precious little natural light. After dusk, the only illumination came from expensive beeswax or tallow candles or rudimentary oil lamps which cast flickering, unreliable light and filled the air with smoke and the smell of burning fat. Reading, copying manuscripts, or performing any intricate work after sunset would strain your eyes, leaving them burning and aching. The pervasive gloom would contribute to a sense of melancholy, a constant low-level visual deprivation that affected your mood and your ability to concentrate. You'd yearn for the brief periods of natural daylight, the brief warmth of the sun on your skin. But most of your life was lived in shadow. The combination of persistent cold, damp, stench, vermin, and lack of personal space created an environment of constant, low-level physical misery. You would never truly be comfortable, never truly clean, never truly alone. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a systematic assault on your physical and sensory well-being, designed to mortify the flesh and turn your gaze heavenward. But even the most devout monk, struggling against the gnawing hunger and sleep deprivation, would find their spirit constantly battling against the relentless, unforgiving realities of their cold, damp, and often filthy surroundings. It was a daily test, a perpetual penance imposed by the very stones and air of your monastic home, shaping your body and mind in ways that would be utterly unimaginable to your modern, pampered self. Imagine a life where silence isn't just a preference, but a strict, enforced rule. Not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, watchful silence, a constant constraint on your most fundamental human need, to connect, to communicate, to share. For you, as a medieval monk, the monastery was often a silent prison, and the psychological toll of that enforced isolation would be profound, chipping away at your spirit day after day. The rule of silence was absolute for much of the monastic day. In the dormitory, in the refectory, in the cloisters, in the chapel, in many of the workshops, silence was to be maintained. This wasn't just a polite suggestion. It was a divine command, a spiritual discipline meant to prevent idle chatter, gossip, and worldly thoughts, and to foster contemplation. Any breach of this silence was considered a sin, an act of disobedience against the rule and against God, and would be met with swift penance. You would feel the weight of this rule pressing down on you from the moment you woke until you laid your head down at night. Every instinct to speak, to share a thought, to ask a question would have to be suppressed. Think about your own day, the casual conversations with colleagues, the quick jokes with friends, the intimate exchanges with loved ones. Now strip all of that away. You couldn't comment on the biting cold, the blandness of the food, the aching in your back. You couldn't share a moment of frustration or a fleeting moment of joy. Every thought, every emotion, every observation had to remain locked within your own mind. This internal monologue, this constant self-censorship, would create a profound sense of isolation, even when surrounded by dozens of other men. You would be physically present, but socially, emotionally, you would be utterly alone. The only approved forms of communication were those directly related to monastic duties, often conducted in specific areas and under strict conditions. In the chapter house, during the daily chapter meeting, you might be permitted to speak, but only to confess sins, to receive instructions, or to debate spiritual matters. Even then, your words would be carefully chosen, formal, and devoid of personal expression. In the scriptorium, if you were a scribe, you might communicate using a rudimentary system of hand gestures, a specific sign for ink, another for parchment, another for pen. These were practical, utilitarian gestures, not avenues for genuine human connection or emotional expression. Imagine the frustration. You would see your fellow monks day in and day out sharing the same arduous existence, enduring the same deprivations, but you couldn't truly know them. You couldn't share a laugh over a small mundane incident. You couldn't offer a word of comfort to a brother who was clearly struggling. Your interactions would be limited to nods, to shared glances, to the performance of communal rituals. What did you learn about the man kneeling next to you for hours in the cold chapel? Only that he too was enduring. The true essence of human connection, the exchange of stories, of vulnerabilities, of shared humor, all were forbidden. This lack of genuine human interaction would force your mind inward, creating a labyrinth of unspoken thoughts and unexpressed emotions. You would become acutely aware of your own internal landscape, but without an outlet, without the mirror of another's perspective, these thoughts could easily spiral. Doubts about your faith, temptations of the flesh, frustrations with the relentless discipline, these would fester in the silence, growing in intensity, unchecked by the grounding influence of human conversation. The devil, you would be taught, preyed on isolated minds, filling them with unholy thoughts. And indeed, the constant, oppressive silence would create a fertile ground for such struggles. Loneliness would become a persistent, gnawing ache. You would be surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. The shared communal life, paradoxically, could heighten this sense of isolation, as you observed others but could not truly engage with them. Your only confidant, your only true conversational partner, would be God and your own internal voice. This intense introspection could lead to profound spiritual insights for some, a deepening of their connection to the divine. But for many, it would lead to a descent into melancholy, anxiety, or even a form of mental anguish akin to madness. Without the ability to vent frustrations, to seek advice, to simply share a burden, the weight of monastic life would press down with crushing force on the individual psyche. The only acceptable outlet for your inner turmoil was confession to the abbot or a designated confessor. But even this was a formal, ritualized exchange focused on sin and spiritual failings, not on the mundane anxieties or personal struggles that make up the fabric of human experience. You would confess your breaches of silence, your impure thoughts, your moments of doubt, but you would rarely, if ever, express the sheer, overwhelming loneliness or the quiet despair that the enforced silence bred. The fear of appearing weak, of being seen as less devout, would often keep these deeper struggles hidden, even from your spiritual guide. This lack of social mirroring, of the ability to test your thoughts against another's, would profoundly shape your worldview. Your understanding of others would be based on observation alone, filtered through the rigid lens of monastic expectation. You wouldn't know their stories, their joys, their true sorrows, only their outward compliance with the rule. This creates a world of surfaces of performance where true connection is a dangerous luxury. Consider the simple comfort of a shared laugh, the release it brings, the bond it forges. Now imagine that sound, that spontaneous burst of joy as a forbidden act. Laughter was generally discouraged, seen as frivolous, distracting from the solemnity of your vows. The monastery, in its pursuit of piety, systematically stripped away these small, essential human experiences, leaving you with a stark, unadorned existence where genuine emotional expression was rare and often suppressed. The silent prison of the monastery meant that your mind became both your sanctuary and your tormentor. It was a place where spiritual battles were fought in solitude, where personal demons could grow unchecked, and where the human need for connection was systematically denied. You might achieve a kind of spiritual discipline, a profound interior silence, but the cost would be a profound and often painful social isolation. an existence lived perpetually on the edge of your own internal abyss, yearning for a word, a glance, a simple human connection that the rule vehemently denied. This enforced silence was a constant reminder that you had renounced not just the world, but a fundamental part of your own humanity. As a monk in medieval times, the fear of eternal damnation was not a distant theological concept. It was a palpable, immediate threat that governed your every action, your every thought, and to ensure you stayed on the narrow path to salvation. The monastery employed a rigorous system of discipline and punishment, designed not just to correct behavior, but to mortify the flesh, humble the spirit, and constantly remind you of your fallen nature. Pain, humiliation, and fear were tools in the relentless pursuit of piety, and you would experience them all. Imagine committing a minor infraction. Perhaps you spoke out of turn in the refectory, or fell asleep during matins, or lost your temper with a fellow brother, even in a silent gesture. These weren't just mistakes. They were sins, breaches of the sacred rule, and they demanded penance. Your heart would pound with anxiety as you awaited your fate. The most common form of punishment, especially for minor offenses, was public humiliation. During the daily chapter meeting held after prime, you would be called forward, perhaps made to kneel in the center of the chapter house, while your sin was publicly declared by the abbot or prior. All eyes would be on you, a sea of silent, judging faces. The shame would burn, a hot flush spreading across your face, even if you'd long since shed your sense of personal pride. To be exposed, to have your failing laid bare before your brethren, was designed to be a profound psychological deterrent. You might be ordered to prostrate yourself on the floor, allowing others to literally step over you as they left, a symbolic act of self-abasement. For more serious offenses, or for repeated infractions, the punishments escalated. Corporal punishment, the inflicting of physical pain, was not uncommon. This could range from being beaten with a rod or discipline whip, often on the bare back, in the presence of other monks, to self-flagellation, where you would be required to physically whip yourself, usually in private, as a form of atonement. Imagine the sting of the leather on your skin, the sharp pain blossoming into a dull throb, your muscles tensing against the repeated blows. This wasn't just physical discomfort. It was a deliberate act of suffering intended to punish the flesh, to remind you of your sinfulness, and to hopefully purify your soul. The logic was that earthly suffering, willingly undertaken, could lessen the fires of purgatory or even hell. The physical pain, however, was often overshadowed by the psychological torment. Deprivation of food was another common punishment. For a specific period, you might be denied your meager meal, or perhaps only given bread and water, while your already starving body protested with renewed intensity. To watch your brethren eat, to smell the paltry food, while your own stomach gnawed with emptiness, was a refined cruelty, playing directly on your most fundamental human needs. The spiritual justification was that hunger would focus your mind on God, but the reality was often just intense, miserable suffering. Solitary confinement was also used, particularly for grave breaches of the rule or for monks who struggled significantly with obedience. You might be confined to a dark, cold cell, perhaps for days or even weeks, with minimal food and no contact with the outside world. The silence, which was already oppressive, would become absolute, amplifying your inner turmoil, your fears, your loneliness. This was a psychological breaking designed to force profound introspection and repentance, but it often pushed already fragile minds to the brink. The darkness, the cold, the complete lack of external stimulation would leave you alone with your thoughts, and for many, those thoughts could become their greatest tormentors. Excommunication, or temporary expulsion from the community, was the ultimate punishment for a monk. To be cast out, even for a short time, meant losing your spiritual family, your access to the sacraments, and your perceived path to salvation. In a deeply religious society, this was a terrifying prospect. leaving you in a spiritual wilderness, isolated and vulnerable. The fear of this ultimate separation would hang over you, a constant threat, ensuring a high degree of compliance, even if it was born more of terror than genuine piety. Beyond these formal punishments, there was also the penance you were expected to inflict upon yourself, or to accept as part of your spiritual discipline. Sleeping on bare boards instead of your straw pallet, wearing hair shirts or metal chains next to your skin, though these were more common among hermits or particularly ascetic individuals, spending extra hours in prayer or vigil. These were all forms of self-inflicted pain and discomfort viewed as meritorious acts. You'd feel the rough fabric of the hair shirt chafing against your skin, a persistent irritation that made comfort impossible, a constant reminder of your vow to mortify the flesh. Your knees, already bruised from kneeling, would protest against the extra hours on the cold stone. Your sleep, already minimal, would be further curtailed by additional vigils, leaving you in a perpetual state of exhaustion. The entire system was predicated on the idea that suffering was redemptive, that by enduring pain, by humbling yourself, by denying your earthly desires, you were purifying your soul and proving your devotion to God. This ideology, while perhaps inspiring profound acts of spiritual heroism in some, in many others bred a deep-seated fear, a constant anxiety about failing, about being found wanting in the eyes of God and your superiors. Every small infraction, every impure thought, every moment of weakness was not just a mistake, but a potential sin that could jeopardize your eternal salvation. The constant surveillance, the knowledge that any action could lead to public humiliation or physical pain, would create an atmosphere of perpetual tension. You would walk on eggshells, meticulously following the rules, carefully guarding your expressions, suppressing any rebellious thoughts. The fear of the abbot's stern gaze, the shame of public penance, the memory of physical discomfort, these would be powerful motivators, shaping your behavior and eventually your internal landscape. Your spirit, once perhaps full of zealous idealism, would slowly be broken, molded into one of passive, fearful obedience. The scars of this discipline would not just be physical. The psychological wounds, the deep-seated fear, the constant self-reproach, the suppression of individuality would leave an indelible mark. You would learn to live with pain, both physical and emotional, to accept it as your lot, as a necessary step on the path to a promised heavenly reward. But the journey itself was paved with misery, a relentless grind of discipline and punishment designed to strip away everything that made you human, leaving behind only the semblance of a pious, obedient servant, constantly reminded of your own inadequacy and the brutal power of the rule. You might imagine a monk's life as one of purely spiritual pursuits, spent cloistered away with sacred texts and quiet contemplation. But peel back that romanticized veneer, and you uncover a reality grounded in relentless, back-breaking manual labor. Monasteries in the medieval era were largely self-sufficient communities, and that meant every single monk, from the newest novice to the oldest brother, was expected to contribute to the physical upkeep and sustenance of the institution. This wasn't just exercise, it was unending, arduous toil, a source of constant physical misery. Imagine your body, already weakened by a meager diet and chronic sleep deprivation, being pushed to its limits by demanding physical work. The day, already punctuated by hours of prayer in the cold chapel, would be filled with tasks that would exhaust a modern laborer. If you were assigned to the fields, as many monks were, your days would be spent in the relentless rhythm of medieval agriculture. You'd be tilling unforgiving soil with rudimentary tools, heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, or simple spades and hoes, the metal often dull and heavy. Your hands, already chapped from the cold and lack of proper hygiene, would quickly blister, then harden, then crack and bleed. The constant bending, lifting and pulling would wreak havoc on your back, your knees and your shoulders. You'd feel the strain in every muscle, the persistent ache that refused to go away even after a restless night's sleep. The seasons dictated your labor, but never offered true respite. In spring, it was planting, a meticulous back-breaking process of sowing seeds by hand, then weeding the emerging crops, endlessly bending over rows in the damp earth. Summer brought the long, hot days of harvesting, swinging a scythe or sickle for hours under a relentless sun, the sweat stinging your eyes, your throat parched. You'd feel the sun beating down on your head, the coarse fabric of your habit trapping the heat, making you feel perpetually overheated and dehydrated. Autumn meant gathering in the harvest, often involving heavy lifting and hauling, bringing in sacks of grain, bundles of hay, or baskets of fruit. And winter, far from being a time of rest, still demanded work. Forestry, clearing land, repairing buildings, caring for animals, all in the biting cold and often through snow and mud. Your feet would be perpetually wet and cold, your fingers stiff and numb. Beyond the fields, the monastery itself was a demanding mistress. You might be assigned to the kitchen, a hot, smoky, and often chaotic environment. Imagine scrubbing enormous iron cauldrons, blackened with soot and encrusted with dried food, using only sand and coarse rags. The sheer physical effort required to lift, stir, and clean these heavy utensils would leave your arms aching, your back protesting. You'd spend hours peeling and chopping tough vegetables, grinding grain into flour with heavy querns, or kneading vast quantities of dough for the daily bread, your hands and wrists burning with fatigue. The persistent heat and smoke, combined with the constant physical demands, would make the kitchen a particularly brutal place to work. Other tasks might include carpentry, repairing buildings or tending to the monastery's animals, the sheep, goats and cattle that provided wool, milk, and occasionally meat for guests or the infirmary. These were messy, smelly jobs, often performed in muck and grime, requiring brute strength and resilience. You deal with sick animals, clean out stables, and shear sheep, your habit becoming soiled and pungent despite your best efforts. The very air around you would carry the scents of the farm, mingling with the other pervasive odors of the monastery. And then there were the endless mundane chores that keep any community running: cleaning, sweeping the vast stone floors of the cloisters, the refectory, the chapel, hauling water from the well for cooking, washing, and drinking, chopping firewood to keep the limited fires burning, emptying the communal privies, a task both physically demanding and deeply unpleasant, a constant reminder of the raw, unglamorous realities of medieval life. No task was too lowly, no work too demeaning, if it served the needs of the monastery and was commanded by the abbot. For those few monks who were literate, a different kind of toil awaited: the scriptorium. While seemingly less physically demanding, it presented its own unique miseries. Hours were spent hunched over a desk, painstakingly copying texts by hand. The flickering light of candles or oil lamps would strain your eyes, leaving them burning and aching, often leading to poor eyesight in later life. Your hand would cramp from the precise, delicate work of forming perfect letters with a quill, the ink staining your fingers. The cold of the unheated scriptorium would seep into your bones, making your muscles stiff and your concentration waver. Errors, even minor ones, could lead to severe penance, requiring painstaking corrections or even the destruction of hours of work. This wasn't just scholarly pursuit, it was a grueling, repetitive, mentally exhausting task that demanded absolute precision and endless patience, all while battling physical discomfort. The purpose of this extensive manual labor was multifaceted. It provided for the monastery's needs, preventing reliance on the outside world. It was seen as a way to avoid idleness, which was considered the devil's workshop, preventing temptations and fostering humility. And like all forms of suffering in monastic life, it was a penance, a way to mortify the flesh and contribute to your spiritual salvation. You were taught to perform every task, no matter how menial or exhausting, as an act of prayer, offering your sweat and your aching muscles to God. But for your body, it was simply an unending cycle of physical exhaustion. You would carry the aches and pains of your labor every day. Your hands would be rough and calloused, your back perpetually stiff, your joints protesting with every movement. Your energy levels would be chronically low, contributing to the persistent malaise, the dulling of your senses, and the struggle to remain mentally alert during prayers. The joy of accomplishment of seeing the fruits of your labor was often overshadowed by the sheer, overwhelming fatigue and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same. In an unending loop of toil and deprivation, you were a workhorse for God, and your body paid the price day in and day out in a relentless grind that stripped away comfort, ease, and often even the simple pleasure of an unbroken moment of rest. In your modern world, a slight fever or a persistent cough might warrant a trip to the doctor, a prescription for antibiotics, and a few days of rest in a comfortable bed. As a medieval monk, however, illness was a far more terrifying, isolating, and often fatal ordeal. The monastery's infirmary, far from being a place of healing and comfort as you understand it, was often a cold, stark hall of suffering, where the limits of medieval medicine meant that pain and decline were more common than recovery. Imagine the sudden onset of a fever. Your body, already weakened by years of meager diet, sleep deprivation, and relentless physical labor, struggles to fight off the infection. You're shivering with chills one moment, drenched in sweat the next. Your head pounds, your muscles ache, and your mind drifts in a haze of delirium. You would be brought to the infirmary, a dedicated building or section of the monastery, often a large, drafty room with rows of hard beds, much like your dormitory, but perhaps slightly softer, with slightly better blankets. Here you would lie, isolated not by choice, but by the fear of contagion and the limits of care. The infirmarian, usually a monk with some basic knowledge of herbs and first aid, would be your primary caregiver. Forget sterile environments, advanced diagnostics, or effective medications. Medicine in the medieval era was a blend of rudimentary herbal remedies, superstitious practices, and prayer. Your treatment might involve bitter herbal concoctions, bleeding, the draining of blood, believed to rebalance the body's humors, or crude poultices applied to your skin. Pain relief beyond a few potent herbs like opium or mandrake, which were often dangerous, was virtually non-existent. You would simply endure the pain, gritting your teeth, clenching your fists, offering your suffering up to God as yet another form of penance. Common illnesses were rampant and often deadly. Dysentery caused by contaminated food and water would lead to relentless vomiting and diarrhea, rapidly dehydrating your already frail body. Infections from minor cuts or scrapes, made worse by the unhygienic conditions of manual labor, could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to excruciating pain and eventual amputation or death. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various fevers were constant threats, especially in the cold, damp environment of the monastery. And then, of course, there was the ever-present specter of the plague, which could sweep through a monastic community, decimating its members in a matter of weeks, leaving few to bury the dead. You would lie in your infirmary bed, listening to the groans and coughs of your fellow sick monks. The air would be thick with the smells of sickness, sweat, vomit, stale urine, and the pungent aroma of various herbal remedies. The lack of proper ventilation and sanitation in the infirmary meant that it could easily become a breeding ground for further infection, turning a minor ailment into a deadly cascade of complications. The infirmarian, despite his best efforts, was often helpless against the tide of disease, able to offer little more than comfort, prayer, and basic care. The spiritual implications of illness were also significant. Sickness was often seen as a divine test, a punishment for sin, or a chance for purification. You were expected to bear your suffering patiently, to offer it up to God, and to view your pain as a path to grace. Complaining or showing weakness was discouraged, seen as a lack of faith. This expectation of stoic endurance would add a layer of psychological burden to your already intense physical suffering. You would fight not just the disease, but also the temptation to despair, to question God's will, or to simply wish for an end to the agony. The lack of effective treatments meant that many illnesses were long, drawn-out affairs. A common cold might turn into a debilitating cough that lingered for weeks. A persistent stomach ailment could slowly sap your strength over months. You might waste away, growing weaker and weaker, your body racked with pain and discomfort, your mind clouded by fever and the persistent battle against despair. Recovery, if it came, was often slow and incomplete, leaving you with lasting weaknesses or chronic pain that would further hinder your ability to perform your monastic duties. And for many, the journey to the infirmary was simply the first step on the path to the grave. Death was a constant presence in medieval life, and certainly in the monastery. You would witness your brethren sicken, suffer, and eventually die, often in agonizing ways, without the solace of modern medical intervention. Each death would be a stark reminder of your own mortality, of the fragility of life, and of the constant threat that hung over your head. The ritual of last rites, the anointing of the sick, the communal prayers for the dying, these would be familiar sights and sounds, preparing you for your own inevitable end. There was no comfort in a warm, clean hospital bed, no gentle nurses, no effective pain medication. Just the cold stone, the rough sheets, the crude remedies, and the stark reality of your body breaking down. Your only true comfort was prayer, and the hope of an afterlife where such earthly suffering would be no more. But until then, illness was a profound and often terrifying form of misery, stripping you of your strength, your dignity, and your very life, leaving you utterly vulnerable to the brutal realities of medieval disease. While the physical miseries of monastic life were constant, the silent battles waged within your own mind could be even more profound and soul-crushing. Imagine yourself stripped of external comforts, social connections, and personal autonomy, left alone with your thoughts for endless hours in the pervasive silence. Your mind, which modern life keeps constantly stimulated and distracted, would become a labyrinth of doubt, temptation, and for many, a descent into profound mental anguish or even madness. The vow of chastity, as we discussed, was not just about physical abstinence. It was a constant war against the desires of the flesh. In the pervasive silence, without the distractions of the outside world, your own body's insistent urges could become overwhelming. Fleeting images of warmth, of intimacy, of sensual pleasure would intrude upon your prayers, your meditations, your work. These thoughts, deemed sinful and demonic, would fill you with shame and guilt. You would engage in fierce internal battles, constantly trying to suppress these natural human desires, to mortify the flesh, not just physically, but mentally. The struggle against your own biology, against the very essence of your humanity, would be a relentless and exhausting one, a source of constant internal torment. Every impure thought would be a victory for the devil, a stain on your soul requiring confession and further penance. The fear of eternal damnation for these involuntary mental lapses would hang over you like a heavy shroud. Then there was the insidious creeping of doubt. You had dedicated your entire life to God, to a specific path of piety, renouncing everything for a promised spiritual reward. But what if? What if the faith wavered? What if God felt distant, unresponsive to your endless prayers and suffering? What if the monastic life, this chosen path to salvation, was a mistake? These existential questions, amplified by the isolation and the sheer monotony of your existence, could become overwhelming. There were no therapists, no confidants to talk through these crises of faith. Your doubts, considered grave sins, had to be suppressed, fought against, wrestled down with prayer and self-reproach. To admit them openly, even in confession, was to reveal a profound spiritual weakness, a failure of faith that could lead to even harsher penance. The burden of maintaining absolute conviction in the face of profound internal uncertainty would be immense. The sheer monotony of the horarium, the repetitive nature of prayer and labor, combined with the lack of intellectual stimulation beyond approved religious texts, could lead to a particular form of mental anguish known as acedia, often translated as sloth but far more complex. It was a spiritual listlessness, a profound boredom, a loss of joy and meaning in monastic life. You would feel a weariness of soul, a disinterest in prayer, a nagging urge to escape, to abandon your vows, to return to the world. Acedia was considered a serious spiritual disease, a temptation to be fought with renewed rigor and discipline. But it was also a natural psychological response to an unnatural, utterly repetitive existence, and it could plunge you into deep despair, a profound sense of meaninglessness that would mock your vows and your suffering. The enforced silence, while meant to foster contemplation, could also become a breeding ground for other forms of psychological distress. Without the outlet of conversation, of external stimulation, your mind would turn inward, often amplifying anxieties, regrets, and suppressed emotions. Minor frustrations could swell into disproportionate angers. Petty grievances against a fellow monk could fester into bitter resentment. The constant introspection, without any corrective feedback or external perspective, could warp your perception of reality, making small transgressions seem enormous, and your own shortcomings feel unbearable. For some, this intense isolation and sensory deprivation could push them to the brink of what we would now recognize as mental illness. Depression, anxiety, and even psychotic episodes could arise in such an environment. Imagine the sheer terror of hearing voices or seeing visions that you couldn't distinguish from divine communication or demonic torment. Without any understanding of mental health, these symptoms would be interpreted through a purely religious lens, as signs of a spiritual battle, possession by demons, or a crisis of faith. The treatment would not be therapy or medication, but more prayer, more fasting, more penance, further intensifying the psychological suffering. You might be considered mad, and therefore a danger to the community, perhaps relegated to the infirmary or even a solitary, isolated cell, further exacerbating your condition. The suppression of individuality, the stripping away of personal identity through the vows and the rule, also had a profound psychological impact. You were no longer you in the sense of a unique individual with personal desires, opinions, and aspirations. You were a monk, a member of the community, an instrument of God. While intended to foster humility and selflessness, this systematic erasure of the self could lead to a profound sense of loss, a disconnection from your own inner being, leaving you feeling hollowed out, a mere shell of your former self. The ability to choose, to express, to be yourself is fundamental to human well-being. To have that taken away, day after day, for decades, would be a form of psychological torture. You would spend your life in a constant battle against your own mind, against the natural inclinations of your body, against the temptations of the world you had renounced. Your interior landscape would be a battlefield, scarred by doubt, haunted by temptation, and often overshadowed by a profound, pervasive sense of spiritual and psychological distress. The peace and contemplation associated with monastic life were often hard-won victories over a brutal internal struggle, a relentless fight to maintain your sanity and your faith in an environment designed to push the boundaries of human endurance. The quiet despair, the unspoken anxieties, and the silent cries of the mind's labyrinth were arguably the most insidious and inescapable miseries of all. The clang of the final bell, the call to compline, echoes through the cold stone corridors for the last time. Your body, a patchwork of aches and old injuries, moves with a familiar, weary rhythm. Your eyes, clouded by age and strain, barely distinguish the familiar faces around you. You've endured, You have lived a life of profound deprivation, unyielding discipline, and relentless suffering, all in the name of God and the promise of eternal salvation. You have walked this brutal path, from the biting cold of matins to the quiet despair of Compline, for decades. Now, as you lie on your hard cot, the great silence descending once more, allow yourself a moment to reflect. You have sacrificed everything that your modern listener takes for granted: personal freedom, warmth, comfort, abundant food, choice, intimate human connection, even the simple right to speak your mind. You have battled hunger, cold, filth, disease, and the insidious torments of your own mind. You have embraced a life where pain was penance, discomfort was discipline, and joy was a rare, fleeting luxury, often viewed with suspicion. Your hands are gnarled from labor, your knees permanently stiff from kneeling, your spirit perhaps both tempered by piety and scarred by relentless subjugation. Consider this ending, this closing chapter of your monastic life, and contrast it with the scene around your modern listener. You are in a cozy bed, perhaps wrapped in soft blankets, the air warm, the light dim but comforting. You have just eaten a meal of your choosing, full of flavor and sustenance. You have the freedom to switch off your device, to turn over and drift into an uninterrupted night's sleep. You have loved ones near, the ability to communicate instantly across vast distances, and a world brimming with choices and opportunities. The harsh realities we have explored, the perpetual cold, the gnawing hunger, the constant itch of vermin, the isolation of silence, the terror of illness, the weight of constant fear and punishment. These are utterly alien to your experience. The medieval monk's life was not just different. It was fundamentally, viscerally harder. It was a testament to extreme human endurance, born of profound faith, societal pressure, and often sheer desperation. While romanticized in art and literature, the reality was a daily, grinding misery. Yet in that suffering, some found profound spiritual solace, a deeper connection to the divine that transcended their earthly pains. They were the custodians of knowledge, the preservers of texts, the silent engines of a society that desperately needed their prayers and their labor. Their contribution was immense, but their personal cost was even greater. So, as you finally close your eyes, imagine the quiet dignity, the immense strength it took for those monks to simply persevere, day after day, year after year, in a world that offered so little comfort and so much hardship. Feel the warmth of your own bed, the softness of your pillow, the freedom in your breath, and appreciate the profound chasm of time and experience that separates you from that cold, silent cell. The monk's long night has ended for you for now. Rest easy in the knowledge of the comforts you possess, a luxury they could only dream of if such dreams were not considered a sin. Good night.